Hello, good morning and good afternoon. I'm Zaina Bryant, your host for today's presentation. Thank you for joining us. We're going to start with some housekeeping and then we'll move on to the agenda. Hopefully you can all hear me well and the audio quality is fine. If you do experience any issues, you can switch to your computer audio and dial in by navigating to the three dots in the bottom middle section of your WebEx window. And right at the top, you'll find the option to switch your audio and relevant dial-in details can be found there. Your lines have been muted. Please remain on mute for the duration of today's presentation. We do welcome your questions. Please post those via the chat function in WebEx. You can find the chat function at the bottom right of your screen, the speech bubble, or via the three dots. You are also welcome to use the Q&A panel. I'll be moderating the chat today, so any questions and we will aim to pick those up and answer during the session today. The slides and recording will be shared with you via email post today's session. I am joined today by three presenters. We have Renata Galeo, Manager of the Content Specialist Team for WorldCheck. We have Beth Epstein, Content Strategy Director for Customer and Third-Party Risk Intelligence. And we have Aravind Narayan, Global Director of Sales Strategy and Execution for the Refinitiv Risk Business. So let's move on to the agenda for today. I'm going to begin with a short introduction, and I'll then hand over to Renata to share a case study for financial institutions. Beth will be covering our due diligence reports, and Aravind will provide an overview of our solutions for screening, KYC, due diligence, and managed services. So, sanctions are certainly a concern as you are onboarding and or managing your client relationships, and you may be feeling the burden on your KYC programs as a result of the latest sanctions. If you are a user of WorldCheck, you'll likely be screening already for direct sanctions, which will uncover the majority-owned connections of given sanctioned individuals or entities. However, to fully understand your exposure, you'll need to go one step further to uncover in-depth ownership structures of particular entities and or the wealth of certain individuals. Opportunities to do so will be covered today, and I'm now going to hand over to our first presenter, Renata, to take you through a case study. So Renata, I'm going to unmute your line. One moment. Okay, Renata, go ahead and unmute your line.
Hi, thank you, Zaina. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me well?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. It's really a pleasure to join all of you today. My name is Renata, and I am the content manager for WorldCheck. And today I will be taking you through some case studies that will just showcase a little bit of the hidden exposure that financial institutions have when it comes to sanctions risk. So Zaina, if you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. So just as an introduction, we are living through a crisis, really, and sanctions activities moving at a fast speed, changing literally on a daily basis, as you know. So perhaps like never before, there is this need to really understand financial institutions' sanctions exposure, the risk, and that goes way beyond sanctions listing. I think that's one of our main messages here today, is just to reiterate this need to go a few steps further in order to identify a real sanctions exposure. And in WorldCheck, you will be screening for direct sanctions. So that will be your explicit sanctions, names coming from sanctions listing, and you will be able to uncover as well the majority owned connections of a given sanctioned individual or entity. So that will cover the sanctions listing that have a narrative statement attached to it. And then therefore there are sanctioning entities that are not necessarily listed by name, but are owned 50% or more by a sanctioned individual. Now the question is that enough? How about the minority owned sanctions connections that maybe do not fit the criteria of a given narrative sanction statement, but present a risk nonetheless, right? Both regulatory and reputational. So to fully understand your exposure to indirect sanctions connections, you might have to go a step further when dealing with high-risk individuals or entities. And that will be to uncover things like in-depth ownership structures and even the source of wealth of certain individuals. So I will be taking you through two case scenarios that will showcase this need for additional and more in-depth checks. And we'll start, of course, with scenario one, which you already can see in the screen. So here we have the onboarding of a new client, and this is an entity name AB Center from Russia. So as part of your standard onboarding processes, you conduct your standard checks and you do not identify any direct risk. So that will mean that this entity is not listed by a sanctions body, is not directly owned by a pepper government, that there is no known civil or criminal case against this entity, no adverse media, and so on. However, because of the current environment, because of the context that we are living through, this is already a high risk relationship because of the location of the company. Obviously, this is also a construction company, which already sets some red flags just because of the nature of the business, because of being historically an industry with a global higher risk for corruption, bribery, fraud, and so on. So all of that increases the likelihood of hidden exposure to sanctions and other risks for that matter, right? So that will be one case that would perhaps require a targeted and deeper dive via KYC enhanced due diligence checks. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So part of our KYC reports check is to go deeper on ownership structures of entities. And that is to really understand and find out who are the individuals behind a company structure. So what we end up finding in this case is that AB Center, in the AB Center KYC report, is a layer of ownership through several other companies that are masking the person behind it, really. So starting from the bottom to the top, we find that ABC Center is 41% owned by another Russian entity named OOO Center, which in turn is 67% owned by ZAO Center, which is yet another entity that is then 100% owned by an individual named Vladimir R. So there we go. Here we have the name and the face behind all of this. And Vladimir R is not a direct customer, but he's ultimately the person behind AB Center and all the other entities that form part of this layering structure of ownership, which is unnecessarily complex and hence already sets some red flag alerts, right? So it turns out that Vladimir R is a Russian oligarch. He's a close financial associate of President Putin. He's a former state-owned official, and he was directly sanctioned by OFAC, UK, Canada, and Australia. This is a real person with a sanitized name for the purposes of this call, of course, because Data Protection Act, we cannot be using real names here. But this was a person that was indeed sanctioned during the 2014 sectoral sanctions against Russia. So in this case scenario, AB Center is hence indirectly owned by a sanctioned individual. And although on paper is only 27.47% ownership, it is directly controlled by a sanctioned individual, making it an asset that from a regulatory perspective should perhaps undergo assets freeze or any other mandate coming from the sanctions authority, depending on the mandate, of course. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So let's go to scenario two, and then I will wrap up with key takeaways from everything that I'm sharing with you today. So looking at scenario two, and here I have another example, which we are starting with the seemingly clean individual, right? So this is happening quite often at the moment, as you know. So sanctions hit Russia, targeting private wealth perhaps like never before. So we do have a movement of financial institutions that are relooking at their Russian clients. Maybe before they were categorized internally as medium risk, even lower risk, depending on the case, and now they are high risk. So there is this need to conduct enhanced due diligence check, especially because there is already a relationship formed with this individual. You already hold their assets, right? So there is this need for additional scrutiny. So here we have Alexander P, and he is originally from Russia. He has a significant net worth derived from assets in Russia. So as part of your standard diligence, you had already identified that he's a former PEP. He was a member of the board of directors of a media state-owned entity, but he left the position in 2013. However, it is public knowledge that he still operates quite predominantly in the media and marketing space in Russia, which is currently a high-risk activity due to misinformation and war propaganda. Other than that, not listed by any sanctions body, no civil or criminal case against this person, no adverse media, and so forth. But again, because of the current context, this relationship is higher risk, and it would require a targeted deeper dive via KYC. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So as part of our KYC checks, we produce a source of wealth report on Alexander, and that is to really understand where his personal assets are coming from. And we find out that his average asset value is coming from directorship in real estate. So he's the current member of advisory board of Pro International, and that is a Russian marketing consultancy firm. He's also the owner of a 5-unit apartment building in the art district, and that he uses as a short-term rental property for tourists. And all of this looks quite standard and clean, so there is no issues here. And then we find that a very significant portion of his assets are coming from family wealth through Transroute, which is a family-run mid-level grain import, which was established by his grandfather. And again, all looks good and no known risk in this specific assets. And then we find that a substantial portion of his wealth is coming from his 15% ownership on paper, because if we look at the value that he's getting from this company, it is already an indication that his involvement is perhaps higher than that, but nonetheless 15% owner, and currently a current managing partner of a company called Online Research Agency, which is a company that is engaged in so-called online influence on behalf of Russia. So further checks on these entities uncovers that this company was actually recently sanctioned by the EU due to manipulation of public opinion through disinformation related to war propaganda. And again, this is a real company that was recently sanctioned because of the war with Ukraine by the EU as well. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So what are the key takeaways from the case study? So I ran you to the 2 case studies, 2 examples, and this is not to convey a message of fear. We're not saying that in every business relationship there might be a sanctioned individual hiding behind the bush, but it is to illustrate the reality of sanctions. So the key takeaway here is understanding that sanctions risks go beyond what is listed, and that will be your explicit sanctions. So there are several sanction authorities that extend sanctions to a non-listed party through narrative statement, right? And here I have an example in the screen that is coming from the UN Resolution 1718 from 2006, and these were sanctions against North Korea. And as you can see through a narrative statement, then they mention that all member states shall freeze immediately the funds, other financial assets, and economic resources that are owned or controlled directly or indirectly by person or entities designated as such, so designated as sanctions, right? So different sanctions authorities, they can go quite broad in their narrative statement, extending to quite subjective concepts such as indirect control, like what does that mean really? So to go further on ownership level is essential for that. And even beyond that, beyond implicit sanctions and narrative statements, is that sanctions individuals are hiding behind someone else's name. I think it's always important to remember that a sanctioned individual is being financially isolated. And that is why sanctions are so powerful, right? Because they are financially isolating a target. And think about that for a second. but think about yourself. Think about being financially isolated from your assets, from your accounts. You still want to operate. You still want to access your funds and continue your transactions. And sanctioned individuals, they do, but they don't do so using their names. They are the ones that will be creating layering structures of ownership, using associate names and family members' accounts and so on. So going deeper on connections, ownership level, it really is essential when it comes to sanctions. And we do have a solution for that through our KYC reports. So hopefully you come out of this session understanding the power of having this in-depth knowledge when it comes to sanctions risk. That is it from my part, Zaina. Thank you so much. And I think at the end of the call, I will be open to the questions that I think we're having quite a few on the chat already.
Thank you, Renata. So now we're going to hand over to Beth. Beth, I'm going to unmute your line. Just give me one moment. Okay, your line has been unmuted, Beth. Please unmute from your side.
Can you hear me okay? Just want to double check.
Perfect. Thank you, Beth.
All right, fantastic. Hi, I'm Beth Epstein, and I'm the Director of Content Strategy at Refinitiv, and it's my great pleasure to provide you with a high-level introduction to our due diligence product portfolio that can help you with the scenarios that Renata just described. Now, we're going to be covering 3 report types that were sort of hinted at in the scenarios. One is reports that identify a broad set of risks on an entity and its associated entities and key principles. The second one is reports that identify the source of wealth of an individual and surface any associated risk. And the last one is reports specifically to identify the ownership of an entity and really focus on major risks for that. So that's what we're going to be covering in my section here. And I'll talk at the end a little bit about what we recommend with regard to some of the scenarios and specifically what report to use. I know Renata hinted at some of that, but again, just sort of as a key takeaway of what we recommend for some of the scenarios you might be facing in regard to the Russian sanctions. So can we go to the next slide, please? So this is our KYC reports, and these are the ones that help you identify a broad set of risks on an entity and its associated entities and key principles. Now, these address sanction and other integrity risks, money laundering, fraud, corruption, and bribery, and so on, but also covers, like I say, a comprehensive group of risks. So beyond that as well, looks at financial risks, ESG risks, and operational risks, among others. So again, a comprehensive cross-section of risks beyond just sanction and restrictions and those kind of risks. Now, we have a range of levels, but today we're going to be focusing primarily on advanced and premium levels, because their foundation scopes, which you can see in front of you, help surface the kinds of risks discussed in the scenarios, with things like ultimate beneficial ownership searches regardless of the number of levels, and screening on the ultimate beneficial owners and the in-between intermediary owners and individuals and so on to identify the hidden sanction and other integrity risks. Now, our default stake is direct, indirect, 25% stake or more, our default stake level, but we have various research options that will help you customize the foundation packages that you see in front of you to your specific risk appetite. And your rep would be happy to take you through these, happy to take you through some sample reports, as you can just see the first page here. And something about that first page, because these reports are really designed to help you identify a broad set of risks, the idea is also not only to give you the data, but to give it to you in a way that's actionable right away. So I know it's a little small, but you can see on the right side that it's highlighting immediately whether we found a risk across all the different 29 risk areas and 6 different high roll-up categories like integrity, operational, and so on. So you know right away when you look at the report immediately what you're going to see, and you can jump into the details, including linking directly to those risk areas. Again, we'd be happy to take you through specific sample reports so in more detail. This is just a high level, very high level overview. So beyond the ultimate beneficial ownership searches, we also look at full profiling of the subject entity. And again, the default here is 2 key principles, but that can again be added to highlight risk both from the subject entity itself and its wider ecosystem beyond just the owners. Maybe there's an issue with principals as well. Again, there are research options to address your specific risk appetite. Now, at the premium level, I do want to highlight that we also include business intelligence, which is where we collect source commentary from knowledgeable sources about emerging risks in particular, including in relation to these kind of Russian sanctions issues, about the subject company and its reputation in the light of these sanctions. Even if it's not sanctioned, there could be reputational or other emerging risk going on that could affect your reputation if you work with them or continue to do business with them, as well as risks that haven't made official status yet, but could be emerging. Whether it's operational, maybe, for example, they're not particularly sanctioned, but the environment around them is making it difficult for them to operate, so they may be taking other shortcuts that could get them into trouble. Maybe not sanctioned shortcuts, maybe product shortcuts, maybe financial shortcuts, maybe integrity shortcuts that you'd still want to know about, even though they're not specifically related to the sanctions, but are related probably to the environment around them. The operational environment could be harder to work with. So again, this is a broad look at across all different types of risks. So that's our KYC Advanced and Premium. And the difference primarily between them, as you can see, is that the Premium includes the business intelligence. So can we go to the next slide, please? Now, our source of wealth reports dig into an individual's net worth and where it comes from. And as you heard from one of the scenarios, there could be surprises in there. So we look at wealth across specific asset classes, all the way from directorships and business interests to include family businesses, as well as real property assets and so on, and even where we can find them other types of assets. We profile not only the individual, but their network of relatives at this level. And we also capture risks on associated entities, again, as per some of the scenarios here. So again, you can see from the first page that we give a broader sort of storyline of where that person came from, where their assets are, what they cover, their family as we find that, and so on. And then we also highlight what risks we found. Again, we are looking at a broader section of risks than just sanctions. So we look across a whole bunch of different risks, but we present it differently because we were really focusing on the net worth and if there are any risks associated with where they've derived that worth. Now, one thing I do want to mention is, as you can see up here, again, these are the foundation packages. Again, there's elements and research options to customize to your risk appetite. We'd be happy to take you through them. We also have the general turnaround times here for these reports, so you have an idea of what it takes to, how much time you need to have them. We also have express service for those, and we'd be happy to take you through those details, but this is just the sort of the foundation. And when I say most countries here, it is really most countries. The select countries are the locations where it's more difficult to obtain information. The information is more expensive to obtain. And so it does take a lot more of a little bit more time to address that. And not only to obtain the information, but also to vet it properly and make sure that it really is accurate. So there are some countries, and we can certainly take you, your rep would be happy to take you through those details, where there may be a longer period of time to provide the information. But again, we do also have express service available. So this is our source of wealth. And again, business intelligence on the individual is available at the premium level, similar to how we do the other ones. So that's the source of wealth. Now, can we go to the next slide, please? Now, entity verification, many people also call them sort of UBO reports, is really focused on a very sort of surgical focus on ownership structure to give you a quick assessment of, is the ownership of this entity going to get me into trouble? It's faster turnaround and more focused. We're not covering the same broad coverage of all those other risks like we are in the KYC and the source of wealth reports. We're really focused primarily on identifying the ownership structure. And again, our default is 25%, but there are research options, and giving maybe a little bit of an overview of the entity itself, but we're not really giving a full profile. That's not the purpose of this. It's really when you have an entity that you really need to know, is there going to be a risk, a hidden risk here from an ownership perspective? Do I know who really owns them? And particularly in light of the sanctions is there something hidden here from an ownership that's going to get me into trouble? So that's what this is really focused on. So we look at, we don't do, again, it's not as comprehensive about profiling all the different aspects of it. It really is focused primarily on digging into the ownership, the registration information, of course, to obtain that information, and then to identify who the key principals, the key control individuals are, the senior management officials, and obviously the ownership, who has control over it from an ownership, from a management perspective, and then really looking at a compliance screening with WorldCheck of those that we've identified through all the information to see if there's a hidden risk there, whether maybe could be a shareholder, an intermediate shareholder, an ultimate beneficial owner, as we saw in some of the examples in one of the scenarios, or it could be maybe a director is perhaps sanctioned, for example, and is will put you into issues with that. So this is really focused on looking at the ownership and the control environment, not so much across all the different risks, but really to flush out the key major risks, like sanctions and those other big integrity risks. That's the purpose of this. So can we go to the next slide, please? So what does all this mean relative to what we're talking about today in terms of the specific challenges that you're facing in terms of dealing with the new sanctions and sanctions in general? So specifically, if your scenario, for example, is in terms of dealing with your own customers, is you already have an onboarded customer who, as far as you know and what you've checked, is not directly sanctioned. They're Russian or in that area individual, or you already know them to have Russian interests. You still want to know if, as you saw in the scenarios, are you exposed? Are you exposed to indirect sanctions? Is there something you don't know about with regard to ownership or management? And as I said in regard to the KYC, the other question is maybe not exposed to that, but because of the environment, that Russian individual entity or the entity known to have Russian interests, because of the environment right now, may be taking shortcuts that are not sanction related, but could put your relationship in jeopardy. Again, could be financial shortcuts, could be in other integrity shortcuts, and you'd want to know across the whole spectrum. So we would recommend that when you are situated with an entity or an individual, this is why we went through the scopes that we did, is that if you already have an onboarded customer that you've worked with before, and you want to know whether you're exposed to some of these indirect sanctions or other types of risks, including emerging risks of, say, reputation, that's where you'd be looking at the premium reports, whether it's a KYC report on an entity or a source of wealth report on an individual. That's where, especially from a reputation perspective, things that are emerging or perhaps potential damage to your own reputation of continuing association, depending upon what the word on the street about that particular entity or individual is. Now, if you're looking at an opportunity of a new onboarding, certainly you've done your searches and they're not directly sanctioned, it's a Russian entity or individual, again, Russian entity known to have operations, then again, your question would be exposure to indirect sanctions. And there we would recommend the advanced reports, whether it's a KYC for on an entity, again, you're looking at other types of risks as well. Not only sanctions, you dig into that, but again, to see if the environment is maybe making them make short-term choices that could also affect the risk environment. So advanced for KYC for entities, and then source of wealth for individuals at the advanced level. And again, the main difference there is that we don't really have the business intelligence, so it's more, you still identify emergent risks, but not so much on the word of mouth side. It's more things that have really manifested themselves. And then if you already have an onboarding or even a new onboarding of an entity in a lower risk jurisdiction where based on what you've worked with them before, if they're already onboarded or you're discussing with them now, they're not really known to have any exposure to Russian interests or operations, and your own classification has determined that they seem to be lower risk, you still might want assurance regarding exposure to direct and indirect sanctions, as we saw through one of the examples, where is there a hidden risk there? Maybe it's not this particular entity, maybe it's the entity's owner of the owner of the owner, as we saw. So this again would be a targeted, focused look at if there's a hidden exposure to direct and indirect sanctions and ownership with regard to who owns what, and digging into that. That's what your entity verification reports we would recommend, because it gives you a quick look, a quick sniff test if there's something hidden there with regard to the ownership ecosystem. So I'm going to pause there, and that will be the end of my section. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them at the end, and I'll look through the chats and see if there are any questions that relate to the section I've given.
Thank you very much, Beth. And there are lots of questions coming through, so thank you to those that are asking questions. We're certainly going to have some time towards the end for Q&A, and we're hoping to answer all of your questions. If not, we will certainly take them away and follow up with you following today's session. So now I'm going to hand over to Aravind. So Aravind, I'm going to take you off of mute, and then you can unmute your line. So go ahead and unmute your line, Aravind.
Right. Can you hear me, Zana?
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Great. Oh, wow. Yeah, it was fantastic listening to my colleagues, Beth and Renata. I think only a few people can make something so complex as indirect sanctions and reports and enhanced due diligence sound so upbeat. So thanks for that. As Dana mentioned in the beginning, my name is Aravind. I'm a global director for sales strategy and execution here in Refinitiv and LSEG Business now. And I basically look after the customer and third-party risk solutions within Refinitiv. So I'm sure, like us, you have also been spending every waking hour mulling over all the slew of new sanctions that have come through, and at this pace since the crisis, right? We have definitely seen that sea change happening, and sanctions at this speed have been imposed. I've never seen that for a while now. And it's not just any sanctions, right? It's a mixed bag, right? Some banks are subjected to asset freeze, and some are subjected to debt and equity restrictions, and who you can trade these instruments with and who you can't. And there are indirect sanctions when it comes to entities, and when it comes to individuals, obviously there are asset freezes, and then obviously there's an issue of like, okay, is a family member targeted or not? And in some cases they aren't. How would you know, right? So, and again, it's beyond sanctions, right? It's an ESG issue, it's trade controls, it's reputational risk, at the end of the day, it's also the underlying the source of funds, right? So obviously, I'm sure many of the financial institutions are pretty much trying to review the risk and where does the risk lie, and our clients ask the question about, I don't want any Russia risk, but then obviously the question is like, where does it lie? Where is your Russia risk, right? So there are a number of questions around this. So Zeno, next slide, please. So what I wanted to talk to you today about is like our wider proposition within customer risk intelligence, which is part of the customer and third-party risk solutions, and how can we help customers? I mean, obviously 3 pillars. We talk about screening, we talk about due diligence, which my colleagues Renata and Beth touched on, and then we have also got managed services. And as far as screening is concerned, about customer screening because most of you have got WorldCheck with us, so basically looking at the sanctions exposure through various flavors of WorldCheck that you use today. Another thing which I want to touch on is I did touch on about the debt and equity restrictions, and is my portfolio riskier than before? Am I holding assets that should not have been in the first place because of the sanctions imposed? Are there any restrictions that I should be aware of? That's why we combined LSEG's financial market data and the indirect sanctions and direct sanctions research that we have within WorldCheck, and we combine that and produce a new product, which is what we call financial instruments risk intelligence. I know it's a mouthful. You can call it FIRI. What it does is it's basically what we give you is data around what are the direct or indirect sanctioned instruments, debt, equity, warrants, options, futures, etc., that you hold today in your portfolio, and you can screen it against it and figure out whether your portfolio is riskier or less riskier than what it used to be. And another use case which you often forget is the screening transactions. I mean, we have heard about a number of fines in recent past about certain banks being fined about sending payments to sanctioned countries, right? So that we can help you with that as well in terms of using the same world check sanctions data. You can screen your transactions and payments through using our data. And the middle pillar I'm going to leave because you heard about it for almost 30 minutes. So I'm going to pass that and then move on to the managed services. Again, another question you often get is like, hey, we realize like, the risk after risk review, our landscape has changed. Some things are more risky, and we are getting this huge kind of number of alerts because of the updates that we have made to several records since the crisis. So obviously, sometimes there can be resource constraints about like, oh, I can't manage all of this, right? So obviously, we offer managed services as well as part of this, where we could help or work with you and remediate or adjudicate your case alerts and help you kind of get to that resolve matches in a way based on the risk appetite that you tell us, right? So we can definitely work with you on that. And another one which we can also help is about managed services for Fury. So you want to do a once-off screening of your existing portfolio and figure out if if you're holding any instruments that are riskier than it used to be. You want to assess your existing risk. And update your matrix. We can help you with that as well. So we again work with you. We collaborate on sending a number of instruments that you want to look at. We screen, we send you a report back, and all of that stuff. So we can do all of that, those things for you. And again, if you would like to know further about any of these, either get in touch with me or your corresponding associated account managers, and they can help you solve that and get in touch with the right teams. So yeah, that would be all from me, Zaina. And I see that there are tons of questions, very exciting. So yeah, I'll hand over back to you, Zaina, and we can open the floor.
Thank you, Aravind. And now we're going to move across to Q&A. So I'll be opening up the question panel here, and we'll start with the first question, if that's okay. I'm just going to unmute the lines of my colleagues so that you're able to answer those questions. So one moment. Okay, I think all lines hopefully should be open now for Beth, Aravind, and Renata. Okay, so first question I'll ask is, in your first case study, I think this one is for Renata. In your first case study, you said that the sanctioned individual controlled the company he owned 27% of. How do you know this? And is it the fact that he has control that is the main risk, or simply that there is a connection at all? Renata, are you able to respond to that?
Yes, of course, and that is a great question. So how do we know that he owned 27% or more? That is part of our checks for RDDs, is to look at the ownership structure. So we have several sources available that we use for consultancy basis to gather that type of information. And like I said, I think one of the main values of the KYC reports is that we can go quite low, depending on the report, of course, in terms of looking at the ownership and the different connections, and to expose the hidden true ownership, right, of layering of entity ownership, which was one of the cases that I presented. So in terms of the risk, is it because of the control or is it because of the connection? It's both. And that was a case study, but depending on the case that you're looking at in front of you and depending on what sanctions body you're looking at, it might be because of a control, direct control, and then that would mean direct or indirect. Like I said, depends on the narrative statement of the specific sanction body. Then that would mean that there is that entity is also sanctioned. And therefore the risk is there. You don't want to be doing business, obviously, with entity that is sanctioned by association. But it could be just a simple association, maybe because of the sanctioned body that you're looking at. Let's say OFAC in the 50% rule, this goes lower, right? So maybe that entity is not sanctioned by association through OFAC, but there is an association nonetheless. And there are risks involved depending on your risk appetite. It could be reputational, it could also be regulatory, as I said. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you, Renata. So moving on to the next question by the same individual. Is this DD service provided by Dun & Bradstreet?
Take that. So the DD service is our own DD service. So we are providing the information. We have a lot of specialist resources that are very knowledgeable about different countries in terms of where to get the information from, how to interpret the information, and how to put it all together and analyze it in a way that makes it easier for you to get the key takeaways that you need. We do source some information from a broad array of sources, including Dun & Bradstreet in some cases, but often we're really using local sources, corporate registries, and the like. So it's across the gamut. That answer your question?
Thank you, Beth. Moving on to the next question. What if a prospect that we are looking to onboard is associated with a sanctioned entity? The owner is a PEP, but is not sanctioned.
I can answer that one. So what if a prospect that we're looking to onboard associates with a sanctioned entity, the owner is a PEP but is not sanctioned? It's going to depend on quite a few things, quite a few variables, the main one being your risk appetite. So to really understand where you sit in terms of your own measures to identify risk when it comes to sanction association is, I think, the first step. So once you have that understanding, then you can look at what that risk look like for you. But again, it's very similar to what I said in the other answer just now, is that it really depends on what it means, what does that association looks like, and what the sanctions body is saying. So it could be that there is a indirect control, and then you're looking at the UN and they have a resolution saying that indirect control will also be considered sanctioned, and therefore you're dealing with a sanctioned entity. But again, OFAC 50% rule, then maybe not directly sanctioned, but there is an association, and then that will be extremely dependent on the risk appetite and how the relationship looks like.
Thank you, Renata. So next question, can you outline cost factor? If that's unclear, we can skip and move to the next question.
And I think that's a little unclear. I think we need more context for that, so we may need to follow up with that later.
Okay. If a transaction is routed from one country to China and thereafter it is remitted to Russia, how can the originating country be helped using WorldCheck data to ensure that this transaction had a final destination of Russia?
So let me try to take this one. It is a complex one. If a transaction is routed from one country to China, and then remitted to Russia, how can the originating country be helped using WorldCheck data to ensure that this transaction had a final destination to Russia? So look, this is a very broad question. I'm not sure exactly where the risk will be here. Remember that we have a lot of sanctions on Russia, but it's not a comprehensive one yet, in the sense that there is absolutely no way you could be doing business with Russia. So I'm not sure if this is relevant on this specific case here. But in terms of using WorldCheck, as I said, you're gonna have access to explicit sanctions information, and you're also gonna have information related to narrative sanctions. So that will be narrative statements that are emitted by the sanctions authorities. So you would have direct ownership connections to WorldCheck, which will also hopefully help you build those connections and conduct checks in order to identify that type of risk. Hopefully I answered the question to the best of my ability.
Thank you, Renata. Okay, so let's go to the chat window as well. So interested to hear how quickly your platform is able to update ownership percentage stakes of businesses, where in recent weeks we have seen so-called Russian oligarchs either dilute or fully divest their involvement in businesses where they have previously been persons of significant control. So this is a scenario that lots of businesses are struggling with. The US 50% rule is proving to be a bit of a headache for many companies at the moment. Lots of folks are concerned about these sanctions invasion tactics being deployed and how businesses can proactively respond to this dilemma.
Yeah, I can take that one, and I'll ask Beth to just help me at the end. So that is a great question, and it is happening quite a lot. We are seeing that from, I think that was the 22nd of Feb, we did see a high movement of ownership being changed, sometimes even from Russia to other countries, and changing completely the owners because of sanctions risk. And what I can say about that from a WorldCheck perspective is that we would still cover direct, which I think you mentioned OFAC, which will be the 50% rule. So we will cover that. And even if the ownership changed, if it changed after the fact, meaning after the sanction was deployed, then we're gonna record either way, even if it's former. And that is because we understand that this is being done for a reason, right? Which is to evade the direct sanctions connection. But when it comes to KYC report, and maybe Beth, you can complement my answer here. I think that when it comes to ownership, you also look at historical ones, right?
Yeah, so let me take that. So thanks, Renata. In the sense of the thing to keep in mind, everybody, is that the due diligence reports are a quick point in time to identify what's happening, what happened before, and things that might be happening from a risk perspective going forward. You know, WorldCheck is obviously doing a great many things, but the due diligence is more of a surgical strike. It goes in and looks very focused on collecting all that information right then to look back and forward right then. So as you mentioned, Renata, is basically that we look at the historical information in terms of who previously was owner. And the other thing I would add is why there was a change there. And this is a lot of times where the business intelligence is key in these situations for the premium reports, where you see on paper, you see from the corporate registry, as we identify that, you know, 2 months ago or a month ago or a week ago or whatever, ownership change. The question is what's going on here, especially if you've got multiple changes and who those new owners are. You don't give your business to somebody you don't trust. So even if you're trying to evade sanctions, there may be more going on here. So they may be trying to evade sanctions, but then invariably, what's the relationship between who owns it now and who owned it before? And that's where a lot of the business intelligence can really come into play, where that kind of stuff somebody always knows, and you would have to identify the right source to be able to provide that information. So not only can you confirm that there was a change in ownership, but you can try and dig into some of the reasons why there was a change in ownership, whether it really was triggered by the sanctions and the intent to avoid the sanctions, and also what the relationship is between who owns it now and who owned it before, which may still expose you to risks, even though it's not the same sanctioned person who owns it.
That's great. Thank you, Beth. So let's ask another question from the chats panel. For SOW advanced and premium, can you give examples of potential risks identified?
So apart from the scenario that Renata went through with regard to a hidden risk in there of the association, the bigger network of where the source of wealth was coming from, I can certainly give you some other examples beyond just sanctions. We've seen a number of situations where we've had people who have derived their wealth, for example, that may now all be in property and in businesses, but it may actually have originally been from a criminal enterprise. We've certainly seen that. So if you look on paper right now, it's all tied up in real property and businesses and so on, but you identify that the original kernel, the original pot of gold, was sourced from, we've seen actually bootlegging, we've seen artificial, counterfeit tobacco, all kinds of things, anything you can think of, we've probably seen it. Or we've seen dubious property transactions that were either illegal or very much unethical. And that's where the original pot of gold was. And again, that's digging into it, which is really where the business intelligence comes into play to see where it all started. Because when you see, 10 years later, when they're applying to be your customer, they may have laundered it, they may have cleaned it up, but this is the kind of thing that helps get into more of the details. or it may be from a family member who, maybe not the individual, but we've seen where some young folks who have not had a long work history have a lot of wealth, which actually comes from a family member who can't apply directly to you because they do have some sort of integrity, sanction, or other issue. So again, identifying that sort of where the wealth is coming from a larger ecosystem perspective. So hopefully those are some examples. And again, the point is not to scare you with these. The point of this is to help identify where the hidden risks might be. So hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you, Beth. There is a really high volume of questions coming through, so if we don't have an opportunity to answer them today, we'll certainly take them away and respond back. So thank you again for your questions. So let's continue on. We've got about 10 minutes left, so we'll move to the next question. Can I do a bulk upload in entity verification?
Yeah, so I'll take that one. We have a due diligence portal actually that allows you to order singly or to request a whole bunch of orders at the same time, and our reps would be happy to take you through that. We won't have time for that today, obviously, but we have a due diligence portal that also makes it easier for you to order your reports that you want, to view the reports that you want, to also protect the security so we don't have it passing through emails and all this kind of thing. So essentially, you'd be able to do that through our due diligence portal, and we can obviously have your rep give you more information on that. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you, Beth. Next question, for those that have the screening tool only, will the ownership percentages be made available for Russian entities, or do we need to buy an add-on product to access these? At the moment, we are finding that WorldCheck is not picking up on some entities that are sanctioned by extension.
I can answer that one. So WorldCheck will include the narrative statement, the implicit ones, which are usually 50% own, indirect, direct, or an aggregate relating to a sanctioned individual, right? So we will have that. The value of the KYC reports is, again, that targeted search. So to answer your question, yes, we will have that on WorldCheck, but if you want to go lower, then the targeted approach of the KYC report is where the value is really at. The other thing is one of timing, right? We are dealing with a high volume of primary sanctions coming through for our researchers, and to build on those connections take time, and we are working through it as fast as we can. And with the KYC report, you do have the value of having that targeted search, meaning researchers stopping everything on the KYC side to look at those connections for you right then, right now, so we can answer to your immediate needs when it comes to identifying the risks, hidden risks. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you, Renata. Next question, what is the difference between entity verification and KYC reports?
Okay, so let me take that one. So clearly I went too fast. So let me back up a bit and say the big difference between them is that the KYC reports on entities look at a broad range of risks. So we're not only looking at sanctioned risks, we're looking at corruption and bribery risks, we're looking at tax and tax compliance risks, we're looking at operational risks, we're looking at ESG risks, financial risks, etc. So we're really looking at a broad range of, we cover 29 different risk areas that roll up into these big categories of questions like, will I get myself in trouble with them because they've got integrity? Are they financially stable? And financial risks, operational risks. That's what the KYC covers. So we're looking at a broad connection of risks. So it may not be about sanctions specifically, though we're looking at that, but we may highlight, for example, as I gave in my example, that because of the sanctions environment, because of the operation environment, access to credit and so on, may be getting harder. People don't want, their customers don't want to deal with them, even if they're not sanctioned. They may be taking other shortcuts that will make you want to think about whether you want to continue your relationship with them. Maybe they're engaging or being tempted by committing fraud or changing their product or whatever they are doing, or substituting product, or even counterfeiting product, who knows? So across a whole bunch of risks. So we're looking at a lot of different risks for the KYC reports. For the entity verification reports, we're really focusing on ownership. Who owns them? both the ultimate beneficial owners, the intermediary owners, and the controlling individuals, so the senior management officers, and are there any major risks, meaning the world check type risks, the big sanction risk, the big restriction risk, the key adverse media risk that we find through our compliance sanction screening, big screening risk for the ownership and that wider environment. Like I say, you ultimate beneficial owners, intermediary ownership, the entity itself, of course, and the senior management officials. That's what we're focused on for entity verification. We're not covering operational risk. We're not giving you a broad profile of what the entity does and when it was established and all that. We give you a certain amount of information, but if you want a deeper, more comprehensive dive on understanding the business, that's where you're going to look at KYC. If you're really focusing on hidden risks of ownership and the ownership and control environment, that's where you need to look at entity verification. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Beth. And just another follow-up on that for entity verification, is it applicable to family offices?
It depends on the jurisdiction, but yes, it's certainly something we can dig into more detail, but we cover all different types of entities. So if the information is available, if they have to file, we look at the information that's filed, or we look at the best local equivalent. And again, there are some differences in terms of what information may be available in different jurisdictions, but your rep would be happy to talk you through that.
Great, thank you. Next question, does WorldCheck or FIRI help to identify clients' crypto transactions related to terror financing or sanctions?
I can answer that one. So to a certain extent, yes. So of course, we are not looking at only the cryptocurrency environment in the sense of extending our risk to only that, but we will, meaning that if fitting our inclusion criteria, we will definitely have that. And we are also starting to include some numbers related to the cryptocurrency space in our records in WorldCheck. That will be related to risk that we cover, exactly what you mentioned, terrorism related, money laundering related, drug related, and so forth.
And just to add on to that, from a due diligence perspective, those are some of the risks that we do look at as well in terms of their association, not so much specific to cryptocurrency, but in terms of if they're associated with known terrorists or there's information about that, money laundering, those are a lot of the integrity risks that we also look at, in the KYC reports or the source of wealth reports.
Yeah, well, one small thing to add there was about the fact that we do cover illicit wallet addresses if it is listed in a sanctioned like a list, like OFAC, for example. Now, OFAC started covering illicit wallet addresses if they see something. So we do cover that in WorldCheck today.
Great.
That's it.
Thank you. Are you planning to incorporate crypto assets or transaction screening in your products in the future?
Very good questions.
I can take that. It's something that we're looking at in due diligence, for example, and across some of the other kind of platforms and products that we have. But there are some limitations with that in terms of information that is available, certainly in different jurisdictions and access to that information. Obviously, there's data privacy issues as well, personal information privacy and various other things, but it is definitely something that we're looking at.
I think just to add, is a highly unregulated environment, right? And of course, that what we do, it is very much depending on regulation. So, I mean, we're definitely everyone is with their eyes on that, because we understand the value, we understand the risk. Because as unregulated, we understand that there's quite a lot happening in terms of money laundering and that type of risk associated with that. So it's definitely something that we are looking at and seeing what can be done.
Yeah, just one last thing on that topic. As a founding member of the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime, Refinitiv is now also forming within the coalition a digital currency task force, basically looking at exactly this. So based on the outcome of all of that, we will be looking at how we incorporate that in our products.
That's great. Thank you all. Thank you very much to our presenters today. We are now at the end of our session. I know there are many, many questions that have still not been answered, so we'll certainly take those away and we will follow up with you afterwards. So following today's webinar, there are some good resources that you'll have access to. I'll be sharing the presentation slides post-session, and there are some past webinars that you can listen into covering the changing sanctions landscape, and also some further detail on the due diligence reports. If you need some specific support, there is a link here to request the type of support you require. If you would like to arrange some training, I see some questions in the chat on following up with some specific training. Happy to have that arranged for you. You can email training@refinitiv.com and we'll ensure that your customer success manager gets in touch with you to follow up. We have lots of upcoming Refinitiv Academy classes, so take a look at the upcoming schedule. Anything outside of here that you need some help with, you can reach me also directly, and my contact details are here on the screen. Thank you again for joining today's session. I really appreciate your high levels of engagement. Thank you again to the presenters. Great job. Take care, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Oh,
Bye.
bye-bye.